Global Insights, and it's a pleasure to have our Upstream Global Energy colleagues joining me. Clearly, we've got a lot of moving parts here and everything is evolving at a very rapid pace, but regardless, we wanted to take some time to frame how the upstream environment might evolve, not only within the region, but also globally. So from that perspective, we've got a kind of 4 areas of discussion today. One is to talk through about the key producing fields, and more importantly, what are some of the long-term implications from a subsurface perspective, how resilient are the reservoirs and the surface facilities if we get a prolonged shut-in. The second aspect is really to highlight the cost and supply chain implications as we see a sharp movement in oil and gas prices. What is the production exposure for oil and gas companies in the region, and what are some of the implications for them going forward? Lastly, touch on some of the geopolitical, but more importantly, the operational investment risk environment from an oil and gas risk perspective. So, really starting the discussion, Sarah, I'd kind of like to come to you. The current view is clearly complicated, but if you could help us set the scene a little bit in terms of the production landscape in the region. Who are the key producers and really the importance of these countries in the overall upstream supply story?
Thanks, Nick. So Saudi Arabia is the largest producer in OPEC, which produces around 10 million barrels of oil per day. And then Iraq is the second highest producer, which produces around 4 million barrels of oil per day. And it's important to note that many of the world's largest oil fields are located around the Gulf region, including Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, Zakum in Abu Dhabi, the Rumaila North and South field in Iraq, and the Bagham field in Kuwait. And these fields contribute a significant proportion of their respective countries' oil production. Iraq, Kuwait rely on those Gulf oil exports, as do the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to kind of a lesser extent. So if that Gulf export route is choked off, for some of these countries, there are limited alternative export possibilities. Just as an example, for Iraq's oil exports, over 3 million barrels of oil per day are loaded at the FAO terminal at Basra. And Iraq has limited alternative export options as the country does not have a well-developed internal pipeline infrastructure. So there's basically nowhere else where this oil can go if the storage tanks are full. So, it's a really significant event that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, and just kind of building on that first point, you talked a little bit on the Iraq situation, and we have heard obviously in the last 24 hours that Iraq is kind of paring back production by about 1.5 million barrels per day, but potentially shut-ins that could extend beyond 3 million barrels a day. Now, the timing, all of this is obviously quite uncertain, and particularly different countries have different storage capacities. But I want to get some of your perspectives, like, let's we fast forward in a certain duration and time, and we do get a shut-in, a proper shut-in of fields rather than paring back production. Clearly, I think it has some subsurface implications, doesn't it, in terms of what that means for a future ramp-up?
Yeah, it does. I mean, at the moment, there's kind of too many unknowns to provide an accurate field-by-field prediction at this stage. And a lot depends on how long those fields are shut in for. If it's a short time, then, the implications are not as great as if you were shutting in for a lot longer. What we're seeing in Iraq at the moment is there's a reduction in production at those fields, including the biggest producer, Rumaila, where production has been halved. A partial shut-in is a better option than a total shut-in. We're also seeing fields in the north of Iraq and the Kurdistan region being shut in as well. And this is largely due to security concerns rather than necessarily the storage problems, because they can export through the northern pipeline. But further reductions are going to be likely if the situation continues long term. And in terms of implications, well shut-ins can lead to pressure issues, various forms of reservoir damage, including formation damage, loss of permeability. Long-term well shut-ins can also, have problems where you get corrosion with the casing, loss of the perforations, and these issues can reduce well productivity in the long term and mean that you need extensive well repairs, well workovers, and rehabilitations before you can ramp your production back up. Also, something like a sudden stop in production can cause pressure imbalances within the reservoir as well. And the likelihood of temporary or permanent damage rises during prolonged shut-ins. And a rapid restart. But one thing I will say, though, that technology and reservoir understanding has improved over the years. And, there are international oil companies working here with the national oil companies, and they will work closely together to take a careful approach and try and mitigate those associated risks. They kind of know what they're doing, and I'm sure it will be a controlled way that they do that, and they are fully aware of what problems could be caused by these long-term shut-ins.
Right, and then let's hope we don't get to that point. So, Juliana, clearly we've seen actually force majeure being activated, particularly in the relation to Qatar Gas, and they've also kind of highlighted the fact that a ramp up is going to be, even from this point, would be a week or a couple of weeks to a month. So, facility shut-ins, supply disruption, they're important. But then from a contractual point of view, which is what your team looks at, what are some of the obligation and legal consequences around shut-ins like this if it is prolonged?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yes, as Sarah said, because of the uncertainty, there are some things that are not 100% clear yet, because there have been some cases where force majeure has been invoked. In other areas, it's being considered. The first thing I would say is that from a legal point of view, I would say there should not be. So operators are legally justified in most of those cases to have, to invoke force majeure, and that's because war and armed conflicts are explicitly listed in almost every single upstream contract around the world. So from that angle, I don't see any issue or other parties contesting that. But there are still obligations for companies to mitigate, and how fast things can be started. So you can invoke force majeure, but then the sooner you restart activities, that's very important for potential liability claims, for potential breach of contract. So a bit what Sarah was saying, it's not only thinking about the shut-in, but how that shut-in is done, because also environmental obligations, operators are still liable for things that happen during shut-ins. So that's very important. So that's one thing we are seeing immediately right now as a consequence of what's going on. But then because of the shut-ins or the just stopping exports, like we've seen in what's happening in Qatar, that also causes other issues, because also you may invoke force majeure in an upstream contract, but that doesn't carry to midstream and downstream. Mm-hmm. That has to be also invoked further down the line. And when you have force majeure, when you have a shut-in, also that can have financial implications when it comes to considering reserves. For example, they can be written down and have you could have lending issues as well. So it's important, for these shut-ins to again, it really depends on the duration of the situation, what happens in the long term, because it could end up with contracts being terminated. But and these shut-ins also have a big implication on the supply and the price, and that at the same time creates all sorts of other issues, from insurance claims, right. Potential insurance claims raises in insurance. And what we see, and this is kind of slightly separate, but what we see, and I saw that it was very interesting yesterday, and it just made me think more about long-term things. But what we see, some countries outside the region restricting exports just because of this issue that we're seeing with supply. So Thailand, for example, yesterday announced a restriction on exports, and we think we'll see a lot of increases in emergency supply obligations being triggered around the world. So that's quite interesting, and
that's something we're all going to be watching quite closely. So Basil, you actually put out a couple of short pieces out within our group recently, just in the last 48 hours. I want to come to the supply chain story with you, right? Because that's a kind of a near-term kind of guaranteed kind of implication. We look at the oil prices have moved upwards, gas prices a little bit more markedly. But what are the cost inflation expectations, right, in the short term and potentially the longer term
Yeah, so if we actually look at this, of course, as you said, with the oil price going up and the gas price actually going up further, well, like more than 50%, that actually creates a certain elements that affects the supply chain. So what we're talking about, of course, you're talking about the cost of the actual fuel. That will affect certain elements like the cost of shipping, that's going in there, the cost of insurance, all of this. And on top of that, of course, we've noticed that, for example, in Jabal Ali, there is more than 450,000 containers stuck in. And the time, and for example, now what we're talking about is that there is a congestion of over 10 days stuck there. So there's with the Strait of Hormuz more or less stopping, there is a lot of ships either stuck in or actually waiting in the Gulf of Oman. So that actually cut about maybe 20% of the global oil supplies. And that actually created some sort of pressure on the air flight uh, sort of cargo, because of course you need to compensate for that. So that's increased by over 20% of what is needed. But in general terms, what we can see that for the upstream industry, that the supply chain costs are expected to rise in the shorter term by about 4 to 6%. But also, this is not only affecting the upstream. We're talking about other markets, for example, like fertilizers. We're talking about EVs, because some of the batteries, some of the actual Dubai is one of the biggest hub of trade, so these will be affected as well. But actually, if this conflict persists and goes into a longer term, the 4 and 6% may go up to about 10 to 15%. Of course, that depends on the duration and also what actually will be happening with the compounding effects of the maritime disruptions, especially and the different routes in the area.
Yeah, and that's an important point because we just for our listeners, we are already at a pretty high oil cost and supply chain environment, right, Basil? So,
Yeah.
While you would expect higher commodity prices are there, but when we look at the industry at the moment, we are not in a low cost of supply chain environment. So when we say 4 to 6% on top of 2 to 3, we're effectively already saying 6 to 9, and then potentially longer term going to double digits, which will be quite a bit of a hammer blow for a pretty tight supply chain sector. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, if you look at what's happening in the last 2 or 3 years, actually the costs were climbing up every year. There's of course inflationary pressures actually is there in the last 2 or 3 years. However, even from what was happening today, we have seen that some of it has already the markets actually adjusted for it in the last few weeks or months, because some people were expecting this. So the market is more resilient. So it didn't come like a proper shock. That's what you would expect. That's something that happened suddenly. So some of it is actually taken into account before as well.
So the other point I wanted to kind of catch up with you, Baz, and get your views, because it's quite important. Is you mentioned about we don't have full visibility of infrastructure damage, right? And clearly some elements could be by the end of this whole part, and there's a question of premium, right? Or
Yeah.
what do you mean by premium, right? And what does that really mean in terms of maintenance and repair obligation that might emerge?
So what happens if, for example, if we look at what's happening now, that we do know that some damage that has been sustained in the Iranian
Right.
side, and actually less damage in some of the Gulf facilities. So if we look at some of the, especially on the Iranian side, there will be more damage, because you're not talking only about the facilities, talking about infrastructure damage as well. So there will be definitely what we would actually call a maintenance premium that will definitely, or repair premium that will actually you need to add into each barrel of oil when you're trying to reproduce them, to produce the oil. And of course, in the case of Iran, there will be a lot of logistical hurdles as well, because we're talking about inefficiency, we're talking about some scarcity of the parts that you need to actually try to repair and maintain the facilities. But so actually, we did put some numbers even on like how much will that be added, if maybe about maybe $12 to $20 per barrel as a spike, what we call a repair premium. That's in the future when these things are happening. Now, if you look what's happening in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, actually there was some damage, and the satellite pictures showing you some damage. However, this damage is not as much. So actually, cost-wise, it is not that high for now. But we don't know the exact details of what the damage is. But what we need to know that actually the shut-ins are actually due, they are more precautionary because you don't want to incur more damage. But in the gas case, which is the more important, actually what we have seen that one of the hits was into the pre-treatment facilities, which does affect more than one train. So actually, even though the LNG facilities themselves were not hit, actually what was hit in the fan was the pre-treatment facilities, which affects the treatment of the gas that feeds into all these facilities.
And obviously, there's more to come on this front. So, look, the company exposure is a big aspect to it, right? Rajeev, I'd like to kind of bring you into the story here because give us a sense of some of the headline numbers and really from kind of, the different set of peer groups that are being in the region.
Yes, so essentially, when we think about company exposure, there is the headline numbers, which is the total production, and then there is the net entitlement numbers that actually matter for the Middle East or the companies in the Middle East. And net entitlement number is the production that companies will take on their balance sheets or has financial implications with respect to their results. So for the whole set of oil and gas companies, there's about 5 million barrels of oil equivalent per day that is attributable to companies. This is the global integrateds, which is the majors, the NOCs, the E&P, large and small E&P companies which have exposure to the region. And by the region, I mean essentially all the Middle East countries, Iran, Iraq, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Israel. Now, this 5 million is sort of divided between the majors, which is the global integrateds, as we call them. They have about 2.8 million BOE per day of exposure. Then comes the NOCs, which is the national oil companies, which are international national oil companies invested or having exposure to the region. We are obviously keeping aside the companies from the Middle East when we talk about implications for oil and gas, because they are the center and heart of it, but international companies. So the NOCs have about 1.1 million BOE per day of exposure. And then you have about 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day production exposure for the Asian E&Ps, which is predominantly the East Asian companies or companies from East Asia. And then you have the North American E&Ps having about 275,000 BOE per day of exposure. So broadly speaking, there is some significant implications from a supply perspective, from a company strategies perspective, with quite a bit of scale. But there's a lot of nuance also within this. You have essentially the GIOCs, which are getting, individual companies getting about the most exposed is Total with about 29% of its total production coming from the Middle East. You have then Exxon and Shell with about 20% each. But within the NOCs, it is the Chinese which have a significant exposure to the region. So broadly speaking, you do have quite a bit of nuance with respect to individual company exposure. But at the same time, as a group of companies, quite a bit of exposure.
And that is important, right? Because I think, Sarah, we think about the international players, we go back a couple of decades, if not even shorter time frame than that, they weren't really present in that sphere of Middle East opportunities. And I think the region, particularly a number of the Middle East countries, have been quite proactive in attracting those set of different peer groups into the region, particularly in the last decade. So, how has that story evolved over the last decade? It'd be good for our kind of listeners to get a view on, Middle East was generally perceived to be a locked market, but it actually hasn't been, right?
No, that's really correct, Nick. I mean, historically, the region was really close to international investment. I mean, most of the activity there was done by the national oil companies. It was perceived that it was very difficult to enter the Middle East. But as you said, in sort of like the last decade or so, this perspective has really, really changed. And we've seen many countries that historically were quite closed, like a good example is Abu Dhabi, where they've actively tried to attract international investment through licensing rounds, going the licensing round route to bring new companies in that maybe have never had that exposure to the region before. And there have been lots of successful licensing rounds. There's been, as I said, ones in the United Arab Emirates, there's been ones in Iraq, ones in Israel. This year, we were also anticipating the first opening of international investment in Kuwait, which, a few years ago was completely unprecedented. And they are planning to offer their new offshore discoveries for international investment. And we're also seeing more licensing rounds in Israel and Iraq, which are planned this year. So the region is certainly attractive to international companies because there's significant oil and gas reserves. There's huge opportunities and also huge yet to find potential, which you don't really see elsewhere in the world as well. There's lots of undrilled structures, prospects, leads in the Middle East. And we're seeing new opportunities as well. You sort of move towards unconventional opportunities, such as the Jafurah Basin in Saudi Arabia. And what we're seeing is companies who've previously focused on US unconventional resources who are looking to move into this space in the Middle East. So I think investment was booming in the region. But, obviously, who invests in the future is going to be really focused on above ground risks. So I'll pass it over to Rajeev, who might want to talk a little bit about, sort of the future outlook of international investment in the region.
Yeah, Rajeev, just to kind of frame it a little bit, I want to ask you a specific angle on this, right? Because, we've seen a bit of a shift, at least since the last decade, to markets that are perceived to have lower above ground risk, particularly from this particular event, which is very unique in the sense that it's really spread across the whole Gulf countries. And we see a more move towards a lower risk environment. How will that reshape capital? How will it shape project sanctioning? And, is this going to give people the long-term portfolio resilience that they perceive that was going to be there in these countries?
So for companies that have been looking back at growth, Sarah pointed out some of the US unconventional companies looking internationally. We've had the Asian NOCs also rethink where they're thinking with respect to growth, and internationalization has been back on the radar of many of companies that have started seeing a lot of domestic maturity or essentially looking for growth around the world. And Middle East has been a key element in that strategy. So depending on how prolonged the situation goes on, we do think we're watching three key elements. The first is that there is going to be a sort of a discount to companies when they think about the region with respect to its existence in their portfolios. You pointed out that risk has been on company minds across all company types. We do think the second thing would be that the companies will be looking at the region less as an invest and harvest strategy and add on that risk element to as they think about exposure to the region. And the third, which won't allow scale but is still something to keep in mind, is whether you are inside the Straits of Hormuz or outside, which is essentially whether you're Oman or inside. And the inside obviously means the Persian Gulf and all the scale that brings. But for those companies that do want to take exposure, could that inside versus outside be an element they'll watch? I think yes.
Okay, really interesting. So, conscious that, above ground risk is clearly, I think, come through in this conversation a lot. And Julian, I'd like to kind of end a little bit from you, right? You've touched obviously on force majeure, but your team looks at looking at the legal, contractual, the fiscal, and also the oil and gas risk perspective for around 113 countries. And clearly we've seen a number of these countries do a lot to improve those ratings. What does that now mean? Like, where does the rule book change, and how does that potentially impact these countries?
Yes, it's difficult to say with certainty right now, but we have an idea of where things are going. The reality is that Iran, in particular, it was already scoring quite low in our overall above ground risk picture. But what we see and what we are trying to see is how risk could impact, like what risk position the other countries in the Gulf will likely be. And you can see here in the first image, in the first chart, is that those are the scores that we had for the first quarter of the year before the conflict. The team is just, they started looking at the reviewing the scores just as things kind of started in Iran over the weekend. So they are looking at the implications, and because we score the risk right now, but also looking at 5 years ahead, and that's going to be quite tricky. But I would say so first, it's like I just wanted to kind of paint that picture that Iran was already quite low, whereas other countries in the Gulf were doing quite well. And what we are now thinking is that quite a few of the countries in the region will potentially see a reduction in scores around just the geopolitics and the market access because of the proximity, because of the risks of damage to facilities. So that is quite likely, and we are looking at around a point down in scores for like UAE, and so you can see in the graphic an indication. We are still not set on the scores because we are like the team is working on those, but so that's kind of a key thing for the Gulf. Then other things we are looking at for Iran in particular, well, is state capacity. What happens, how the government is formed, and that will have huge implications. But state capacity is key to have any kind of functioning industry and economy, and so that is one area that is quite that is going to, like it was already low, but it will be, actually it was quite high and will be lowered quite likely. So then there are areas like sanctity of contract that will be reviewed. Ministerial policy volatility, again, is kind of aligned with what's going on and what happens with the government. That's quite key. And then, so that's, and as I said, there are quite a few factors. I was planning on using another image, but I didn't manage to put it in here, but just showing different factors. We score countries. We have 21 factors for above ground risk. And so there are quite a few. I think there are roughly.
And clearly, look, we are in a pretty kind of uncharted territory. So this is an evolving landscape, but I'm sure, in the coming period, we'll bring those kind of perspectives into it as more certainty comes out of this uncertainty, right? Is probably a good way to frame it. So look, we appreciate, this is a rapidly evolving environment. I really hope that people who dialed in or watched us today enjoyed it. I'd like to thank our colleagues for coming and sharing their expertise and perspectives. Please stay tuned, right? We have a lot more coming on these kind of updates on the evolving situation in the Middle East. The S&P Global Energy team are going to be doing a lot more in the coming days and weeks. So please continue to engage with us and support us. And thank you all. And we look forward to doing more of this.